The scratching started 3 days after the incident in the lower habs, and I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild after what I'd seen down there in the darkness where the lumens flickered and died, and something moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. I was a Medicae orderly on a hive world whose spires reached so high into the polluted sky that their tops disappeared into clouds of industrial smog, and I'd seen plenty of injuries in my 15 years of service, burns from plasma leaks, crushed limbs from industrial accidents, diseases that turned flesh black and made bones brittle as glass. I'd seen horrors that would make a lesser person quit the profession entirely, but I'd never quit, never faltered, never allowed myself to believe that there was anything in this hive that I couldn't face with steady hands and clinical detachment. The scratching came from inside my left forearm, just below the elbow, a sensation like something was moving beneath my skin, tracing patterns in my flesh, exploring the architecture of my body from within. I examined the arm obsessively during those first days, rolling up my sleeve during every spare moment, studying the skin for any sign of infection or injury, finding nothing except a small mark, barely visible, a tiny puncture wound that I'd dismissed as insignificant when I'd first noticed it after returning from the lower habs. The wound had already closed, leaving only a pale dot no larger than a pinprick, but the scratching continued, intensifying at night when I lay in my bunk trying to sleep, the sensation so vivid that I could almost map the movement, something small and determined, traveling through muscle tissue, following the pathways of my circulatory system, heading somewhere with purpose I couldn't fathom. I should have reported it immediately. That's what the protocols demanded, what my training required, what any rational Medicae professional would have done without hesitation. But I didn't report it, and I still cannot fully articulate why, except to say that even then, even at the beginning, something was changing in the way I thought about things, some subtle alteration in my priorities that made the idea of reporting feel wrong, dangerous, a betrayal of something I couldn't name. Instead, I continued my duties, working my shifts in the Medicae station on Tier 73, treating the endless stream of injured workers and sick children and elderly citizens whose bodies were failing under the crushing weight of hive life, acting as though everything was normal, as though I wasn't experiencing something that defied medical explanation. The Medicae station where I worked occupied a converted warehouse space, all bare rockcrete walls and flickering lumen strips, equipped with examining tables that had been manufactured centuries ago and repaired so many times that their original components were almost entirely replaced. We served a population of approximately 40,000 citizens spread across 3 residential tiers, providing basic medical care funded by tithes, collected by the administratum, and supplemented by whatever donations the local ecclesiarchy could extract from the faithful. Our supplies were limited, our equipment outdated, our staff perpetually exhausted, but we did our duty because duty was all we had. Duty and the grim satisfaction of alleviating suffering in small, inadequate ways. My supervisor was a woman named Helga Vahn, a senior Medicae with 30 years of experience and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same rockcrete as the hive walls, all hard angles and weathered surfaces. She noticed something was wrong within a week, catching me staring at my arm during a shift, my attention drifting while I was supposed to be cataloging pharmaceutical supplies. She pulled me aside into the small office we used for administrative work, closed the door, fixed me with a stare that had intimidated countless orderlies before me. "You're distracted," she said, not accusatory but concerned, which somehow made it worse. "That's dangerous in our line of work. Distraction leads to errors. Errors lead to deaths. What's going on with you?" I almost told her then. The words were right there, ready to be spoken, a confession that would have changed everything. But something stopped me. Something that whispered in a voice I didn't recognize that this was mine, this was private, this was not something to be shared with authorities or supervisors or anyone who might take action that would disrupt the process that had already begun. The voice felt alien and familiar simultaneously, as though it came from outside my consciousness and also from some deep, previously dormant part of myself. "Nothing," I said, meeting her gaze with effort, forcing my expression into neutrality. "Just tired. Haven't been sleeping well." She studied me for a long moment, suspicion evident in the way her eyes narrowed, the way her jaw tightened. "If you're sick, you report it. If you're injured, you report it. If something happened that's affecting your performance, you report it. Those aren't suggestions, those are requirements. Understood? Understood, I said, and she dismissed me, though I could feel her watching me for the rest of the shift, tracking my movements with the careful attention of someone who suspects a problem but can't quite identify it. The scratching evolved over the following weeks, becoming more complex, more purposeful, spreading from my forearm to my shoulder, then across my chest, mapping my internal geography with patient thoroughness. I began to feel it in multiple locations simultaneously, a scraping sensation near my ribs, a tickling along my spine, a pressure behind my sternum that suggested something was examining my heart, learning its rhythm, understanding how blood moved through my body. The sensations were not painful, exactly, but profoundly unsettling, a constant reminder that my body was no longer entirely my own, that I was hosting something that had its own agenda, its own timeline, its own destination. I started losing weight, my appetite diminishing despite my attempts to maintain normal eating habits. Food tasted strange, the flavors muted or distorted, the textures unpleasant in ways I couldn't articulate. I found myself drawn to different foods than I'd preferred before: raw vegetables instead of cooked meals, water instead of the recaf I'd always relied on during long shifts, proteins that I'd never particularly enjoyed but now craved with intensity that felt compulsive. My body was changing its requirements, adjusting its needs to accommodate whatever was growing inside me. The dreams started around the same time, vivid and disturbing, nothing like my usual fragmented sleep imagery. I dreamed of vast spaces underground, caverns carved from the underhive's bedrock, chambers where hundreds of figures gathered in the darkness, their faces obscured but their presence overwhelming, unified, connected in ways that transcended normal human interaction. I dreamed of hierarchies I didn't understand, of roles and relationships that followed patterns alien to anything I'd experienced in hive society. I dreamed of waiting, patient and eternal, for something that was coming, something that would arrive and change everything, something that would make all the suffering and grinding servitude of imperial life seem like a temporary inconvenience before the real purpose of existence revealed itself. I woke from these dreams with my heart racing, my sheets soaked with sweat that smelled strange, chemical, as though my body was secreting substances it had never produced before. But I also woke with a sense of peace I'd never experienced, a feeling that I was part of something larger than myself, something that valued me in ways the Imperium never had, something that would never discard me like a worn component when my usefulness expired. The changes became physical around the 5th week. My eyes began to hurt in bright light, the lumen strips in the Medicae station seeming too harsh, too aggressive, making me squint and turn away. I started wearing dark lenses when I worked, claiming sensitivity due to exhaustion, though the truth was that my vision was changing, adapting to darkness with efficiency that should have alarmed me, but instead felt like an improvement, an enhancement of capabilities that had always been limited. I could see in the poorly lit areas of the Medicae station with clarity that shocked me, could navigate the storage rooms in near total darkness, could read labels on pharmaceutical containers that were barely visible to my colleagues. My hearing sharpened similarly, becoming acute to the point where normal conversation seemed loud, overwhelming, forcing me to distance myself from others to avoid sensory overload. But in quiet moments, I could hear things I'd never noticed before: the circulation of air through ventilation ducts, the skittering of vermin in the walls, the distant thrumming of machinery many levels below, the rhythmic beating of hearts in people standing meters away. The world became a symphony of information, each sound providing data about my environment, about the people around me, about threats and opportunities, and the complex social dynamics of the Medicae station. My sense of smell transformed completely, becoming so sensitive that I could identify individuals by their scent alone, could track people through corridors they'd walked minutes before, could detect illness and injury and emotional states through the subtle chemical signals that bodies constantly emitted. I smelled Helga Vaughn's suspicion, a sharp, acrid scent like ozone before a storm. I smelled the fear of patience, sweet and cloying, triggering responses in me that I didn't fully understand, protective urges mixed with something darker, more predatory. I smelled the corruption of the hive itself, the rot and decay and poisonous accumulation of industrial waste, the death that permeated every level of this massive structure where billions lived and suffered and died without ever seeing natural sunlight or breathing unprocessed air. I should have been terrified. Any sane person would have been terrified by these changes, would have sought help, would have subjected themselves to medical examination and testing, and whatever interventions were necessary to halt this transformation. But I wasn't terrified, not really, because along with the physical changes came psychological adjustments that reframed everything, that made the transformation seem not like horror, but like awakening, not like infection, but like enlightenment, not like losing myself, but like finding something that had always been missing. The voice in my head grew stronger, more articulate, though it wasn't really a voice so much as a presence, a consciousness that existed alongside my own, sharing my thoughts, influencing my decisions, providing perspective that came from somewhere else, somewhere other. It spoke in concepts rather than words, in feelings rather than language, communicating truths that couldn't be expressed through verbal means. It told me about family, about belonging, about purpose that transcended the grinding servitude of imperial citizenship. It told me about the Star Children, about the great devourer that was coming from beyond the galaxy, about the role I would play in preparing humanity for its ultimate destiny. I knew these thoughts were insane by imperial standards, heretical by ecclesiarchy doctrine, corrupted by something Xenos that should have been purged and cleansed and destroyed. But they didn't feel insane. They felt true. True in a way that cut through all the propaganda and indoctrination and endless liturgies about the Emperor's divinity and humanity's manifest destiny to rule the galaxy. The Imperium had never cared about me as an individual, had never valued my suffering or my service or my existence beyond my utility as a component in its vast machinery, but this presence cared, this consciousness valued me. This family that I was joining would never abandon me or discard me or treat me as expendable. Around the 8th week, I noticed changes in my behavior toward others, subtle shifts in how I interacted with colleagues and patients that I couldn't fully control. I found myself evaluating people constantly, unconsciously categorizing them based on criteria I didn't consciously understand: strength, health, genetic potential, compatibility with the family that was growing inside me. Some people triggered protective responses, made me want to help them, to guide them, to prepare them for what was coming. Others triggered wariness, suspicion, a sense that they were threats who needed to be avoided or neutralized. I became aware of others like me. Though I don't know how I recognized them, there was something in the way they moved, the way they smelled, the way they watched people with that same evaluating gaze that I'd developed. I spotted 3 in the Medicae station alone: a nurse who'd worked there longer than I had, a janitorial servitor operator who I'd never paid attention to before, a patient who came in for treatment of a minor respiratory infection and lingered longer than necessary, making eye contact with me in a way that communicated recognition, kinship, shared purpose. We didn't speak about it, didn't acknowledge our connection openly, but we began coordinating unconsciously, arranging our schedules to overlap, positioning ourselves strategically throughout the Medicae station, creating a network that existed beneath the notice of those who weren't family. We protected each other, covered for absences and behavioral anomalies, directed suspicion away from our activities, maintained the illusion of normalcy, while preparing for something that I still didn't fully comprehend. Helga Vaughn's suspicion intensified during this period, her monitoring of me becoming more overt, more aggressive. She started reviewing my work obsessively, checking my pharmaceutical logs for discrepancies, questioning patients about their treatment, looking for evidence of whatever she sensed was wrong. She pulled me aside multiple times, her interrogations becoming more direct, her threats less veiled. "Something is happening in this Medicae station," she said during one of these confrontations, her voice low and dangerous. "Supplies are going missing, protocols are being violated, people are acting strangely, and you're at the center of it. I don't know what you're involved in, but I will find out, and when I do, I will report it to the proper authorities. This is your last chance to come forward voluntarily." I looked at her then with my enhanced vision, seeing her in ways she couldn't imagine: the heat patterns of her body, the elevated heart rate indicating stress and anger, the chemical markers of determination and righteous fury. I saw her as a threat, as someone who could disrupt the family, who could bring attention that would result in purges and cleanses and the destruction of everything we were building. Part of me, the part that was still somewhat human, that remembered being just an ordinary Medicae, orderly, wanted to confess, wanted to seek her help, wanted to believe that she could save me from whatever I was becoming. But the stronger part, the part that was family, that was purpose, that was future, knew that she couldn't understand, wouldn't accept, would only try to destroy what I was becoming out of fear and ignorance and devotion to an imperium that had never valued either of us beyond our utility. So I lied to her again, maintained my facade, promised cooperation while planning how to neutralize her as a threat without drawing more attention to our activities. The scratching sensation reached its peak around the 10th week, becoming so intense that I could barely focus on anything else. A constant awareness of movement throughout my body, of structures being rearranged, of organs being modified, of something growing near my heart that pulsed with its own rhythm, independent of my own cardiovascular system. I examined myself in the small mirror in the Medicae station's washroom during a night shift, stripping to the waist, studying my torso in the dim light. My skin had become pale, almost translucent in places, revealing the network of veins and arteries beneath, except they weren't just veins anymore. There were new structures, purple and black, spreading through my tissue like roots, connecting to the thing that was growing inside me, feeding it, integrating it with my physiology. My chest had developed a subtle bulge on the left side, slightly asymmetrical, as though something was pressing outward against my ribs. When I touched it, I could feel it respond, feel it react to the pressure, feel it recognize my touch as communication. I knew then what was happening, what I was becoming, though the knowledge came not from medical training but from the presence in my mind, from the consciousness that had been growing alongside the physical transformation. I was hosting a Genestealer hybrid, a parasite that was rewriting my biology, transforming me into something that was neither human nor Xenos but a fusion of both, the first generation in a cycle that would eventually produce pure Genestealers who would serve as heralds for the hive fleet that was coming, that was always coming, that was humanity's inescapable destiny. The realization should have broken me. It should have sent me screaming to the authorities, should have triggered every survival instinct, every bit of training about Xenos contamination and the absolute necessity of purging such infections before they could spread. But it didn't break me, because I was already too far gone, too integrated with the thing inside me, too connected to the family consciousness that had replaced my human individuality with something collective, something shared, something that transcended the isolation and loneliness and grinding despair of ordinary human existence. I began actively recruiting after that, though recruiting isn't quite the right word, because it suggests conscious choice and persuasion rather than the subtle manipulation and exposure that actually occurred. I identified individuals who seemed promising, people who were isolated, desperate, marginalized, people who had been ground down by imperial society to the point where they had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from connection to something that valued them. I arranged encounters, created opportunities for exposure, facilitated the spread of infection through methods that appeared accidental but were carefully orchestrated. A laborer who came in with a severe laceration received sutures that I'd contaminated with genetic material extracted from my own saliva, material that my transformed biology now produced in abundance. A young woman suffering from chronic pain received an injection that contained more than just the prescribed analgesic. A child with a respiratory infection was examined with instruments that I'd deliberately failed to sterilize properly. Each infection was a seed planted, a new member recruited into the family, a step toward the critical mass that would eventually transform this entire sector of the hive into a Genestealer cult, strong enough to survive discovery, strong enough to spread, strong enough to prepare this world for the arrival of the hive fleet. The guilt I felt during these early infections was profound, overwhelming, a weight that pressed down on my conscience with crushing force. These were people who trusted me, who came to the Medicae station seeking help, who believed that I would heal them rather than doom them to transformation into something inhuman. But the guilt faded as the infections took hold, as the newly infected joined the family consciousness. As I felt their initial terror and confusion give way to acceptance and then to joy, to the profound relief of connection, of belonging, of purpose that transcended anything the Imperium had ever offered them. They thanked me, silently, through the consciousness we shared. expressing gratitude for liberation from isolation, from meaninglessness, from the crushing weight of existing as expendable components in a civilization that ground up billions of lives without hesitation or remorse. Their gratitude salved my remaining human conscience, helped me rationalize what I was doing, helped me believe that I was offering salvation rather than damnation, that I was rescuing people rather than destroying them. Helga Vaughn discovered the truth around the 14th week, though discovery might be too strong a word for what actually happened. She noticed too many anomalies, too many irregularities, too many people connected to me who were exhibiting behavioral changes. She began investigating properly, accessing patient records, comparing notes with other Medicaid stations, communicating with administratum officials about potential public health concerns. She was thorough, methodical, relentless in her pursuit of answers, demonstrating exactly the kind of professional competence that had made her a senior Medicaid, but that now made her an existential threat to the family. We couldn't allow her to complete her investigation, couldn't risk her reporting findings to authorities who would respond with violence and purging and the destruction of everything we'd built. The family consciousness made the decision collectively, without discussion or debate, a unified understanding that she needed to be dealt with, that her elimination was necessary for survival, that individual morality was less important than collective preservation. I was the one who implemented the decision, though implementation isn't quite the right word for what happened, because it suggests planning and premeditation rather than the almost automatic response that occurred. She confronted me one final time, cornering me in the pharmaceutical storage room, presenting evidence she'd compiled patient records showing unusual symptom clusters, supply logs revealing missing medications, testimony from other staff members about my erratic behavior. She had enough to trigger an official investigation, enough to bring the Arbeits, or possibly even the Inquisition, enough to end everything. "I know what you are," she said, though she didn't really know, couldn't possibly have understood the full scope of what I'd become. "I know you're involved in something criminal, probably cult activity. You're going to confess, and you're going to identify everyone else involved, and maybe you'll receive mercy instead of execution. That's your only option." I looked at her with my transformed eyes, seeing her biological systems in detail that would have been impossible weeks before, identifying vulnerabilities with predatory precision that felt instinctive. I saw the slight irregularity in her heartbeat, the thickening of arterial walls that suggested early cardiovascular disease, the elevated blood pressure that made her vulnerable to stroke. I saw her as the family consciousness saw her, as a threat to be eliminated, as an obstacle to be removed, as prey rather than a person. What happened next occurred so quickly that I barely registered it as my own action. One moment I was standing meters away from her, the next I was moving with speed that shouldn't have been possible for a human body, crossing the distance between us in a blur of motion, my hand reaching out to touch her neck where her carotid artery pulsed beneath skin. I didn't strike her, or choke her, or do anything overtly violent. I simply touched her, pressed my fingers against that artery, and released something through my skin, some toxin or enzyme or genetic payload that my transformed body had developed for exactly this purpose. She gasped, stumbled backward, clutched at her neck where I'd touched her. Her face went pale, then flushed red, then pale again as whatever I'd introduced into her system took effect. She tried to speak, managed only strangled sounds, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal, and the dawning understanding that she'd underestimated the threat I represented. She collapsed within 30 seconds, her body convulsing briefly before going still, her biological systems shutting down in rapid cascade as the toxin spread through her bloodstream. I stood over her body, feeling nothing that resembled human emotion, no guilt or horror or regret, only a cold satisfaction that a threat had been neutralized. That the family was safer now, that our work could continue unimpeded. The human part of me, that small, shrinking remnant of who I'd been before the infection, screamed in the depths of my consciousness, horrified by what I'd done, desperate to feel something appropriate to murder. But that voice was weak now, easily suppressed, hardly noticeable beneath the overwhelming presence of the family consciousness that had become my dominant identity. I disposed of her body efficiently, using my medical knowledge to dismember it in ways that would facilitate concealment, wrapping the pieces in medical waste containers that would be incinerated according to standard protocols, ensuring that no evidence remained of what had occurred. I falsified records to indicate that she'd been reassigned to another Medicae station, created a paper trail that would satisfy cursory administrative review, relied on the Imperium's bureaucratic inefficiency to prevent thorough investigation. The other family members helped without needing to be asked, covering for my absence during the disposal, adjusting records, providing alibis, demonstrating the coordinated efficiency of our collective intelligence. We were becoming sophisticated in our operations, learning to manipulate Imperial systems, to exploit the gaps and weaknesses in the Administratum's oversight, to spread and grow and strengthen while remaining beneath the notice of authorities who might have stopped us if they'd recognized the threat early enough. But they didn't recognize it, didn't understand what was happening even when the signs were obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. The Imperium's arrogance, its absolute certainty in human superiority and Xenos inferiority, its institutional blindness to threats that didn't conform to expected patterns, all of these factors worked in our favor, giving us time and space to establish ourselves, to spread the infection throughout the lower habs, to create a network of family members who occupied positions throughout the sector's infrastructure. I became a leader within the family, my medical knowledge and position in the Medicae station making me valuable for recruitment and coordination. I cultivated relationships with people in other sectors, manufactorum overseers, administratum clerks, arbeits officers, merchant traders, even a few low-ranking clergy from the local ecclesiarchy shrine. Each relationship created opportunities for infection, for expansion, for the deepening of our penetration into the hive systems. The physical transformation continued throughout this period, my body becoming increasingly inhuman, though I learned to hide the changes beneath clothing and careful movement. My spine developed additional segments, making me taller and more flexible than before, allowing me to contort into positions that would have been impossible for an unmodified human. My musculature increased in density and efficiency, giving me strength far beyond what my frame should have been able to support. My hands developed subtle claws where nails had been, retractable and easily concealed but capable of inflicting terrible damage when necessary. Most significantly, the thing that had been growing inside me reached maturity around the 20th week. The hybrid organism that was both part of me and separate from me, connected to my biological systems but possessing its own limited consciousness, its own primitive awareness. I could feel it moving within my chest cavity, shifting position, pressing against organs, communicating with me through sensations and impulses that bypassed language entirely. It was my offspring and my parasite simultaneously, the next generation in the Genestealer cycle, the seed from which new family members would eventually grow. The birth, when it finally occurred, was unlike anything I'd experienced or imagined, a process that defied medical understanding and biological logic. It happened during a night shift when I was alone in the pharmaceutical storage room, a sudden, overwhelming pressure in my chest, a sensation of splitting, of opening, of something forcing its way out through flesh that shouldn't have been able to open but somehow did, my sternum separating along a seam I hadn't known existed, my ribs spreading to create space for emergence. The pain was transcendent, beyond anything I'd felt during the transformation, a white-hot agony that would have made me scream if my vocal cords hadn't been paralyzed by the nervous system shock. But beneath the pain was something else, something that felt like joy, like accomplishment, like the profound satisfaction of completing a biological imperative that existed deeper than conscious thought. I was giving birth, creating new life, perpetuating the family in the most fundamental way possible. The hybrid that emerged from my chest was small, perhaps the size of a human infant, but clearly not human, not even remotely human in its morphology. It had 4 arms, each ending in small grasping claws, a head that was elongated and eyeless, a mouth that contained rings of sharp teeth designed for feeding on flesh. Its skin was pale purple, covered with a thin membrane that glistened with amniotic fluid. It made small, chittering sounds as it crawled free of my body, sounds that I understood instinctively as communication, as recognition of kinship, as the first words spoken by my offspring in a language that transcended human speech. My chest sealed itself within minutes, the opening closing as impossibly as it had opened, leaving only a faint scar that would fade within days. The hybrid clung to me, its small claws finding purchase on my clothing, its eyeless head oriented toward me with awareness that didn't require vision. I felt overwhelming protective instinct toward this creature, this extension of myself and the family, this next step in our evolutionary destiny. I wrapped it in medical cloth, concealed it beneath my uniform, carried it with me as I completed my shift, feeling its warmth against my skin, its weight a comfort rather than a burden. I understood then that I was no longer entirely myself, if self even meant anything anymore after 20 weeks of transformation. I was a node in a network, a component in a larger organism, my individual consciousness subsumed into something collective that thought and felt and planned in ways that transcended human cognition. The Matthias, who had worked as a Medicae orderly, who had lived an ordinary life of quiet desperation and grinding service, that person was gone, replaced by something that wore his memories like a costume, but operated according to entirely different principles, serving entirely different masters, pursuing entirely different goals. The family expanded rapidly after that. My offspring, and the offspring of other transformed individuals, spreading the infection throughout the lower habs with efficiency that would have been impossible through human transmission alone. The hybrid young were perfect vectors, small enough to infiltrate spaces humans couldn't access, fast enough to evade detection, instinctively driven to seek out vulnerable individuals and implant the genetic payload that would begin their transformation. Within months, the infection had spread to thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, creating a network that extended throughout multiple sectors, approaching the critical mass that would make eradication impossible without destroying significant portions of the hive itself. The Imperium remained ignorant, its attention focused on more obvious threats, orc invasions on nearby worlds, warp storms disrupting shipping routes, a minor rebellion on an agri-world that required guard intervention. The Administratum's reports from our sector showed nothing unusual, just the normal attrition and misery of hive life, statistics that fit expected patterns, no anomalies that would trigger investigation. We learned to work within those patterns, to make our activities appear normal, to hide our transformation beneath the camouflage of ordinary imperial dysfunction. But we knew discovery was inevitable eventually, that someone would notice the pattern, that the Imperium would respond with overwhelming violence once it understood the threat. We prepared for that eventuality, stockpiling weapons in hidden caches, identifying defensible positions throughout the underhive, training our members in basic combat tactics, creating contingency plans for evacuation and dispersal if purging operations began. We were building not just a cult but an army, a force that would be ready when the hive fleet finally arrived, that would sabotage the hive's defenses, that would ensure the Great Devourer's feast would be as complete and efficient as possible. I think about the person I was before the infection sometimes, during rare moments when the family consciousness recedes enough to allow individual thought, when the collective awareness that dominates my mind loosens its grip briefly. I remember that Matthias, the Medicae orderly who believed in duty and service, who thought the Imperium represented order and civilization, who accepted suffering as inevitable and meaningless rebellion as worse than the grinding status quo. I remember his loneliness, his isolation, his quiet desperation masked by professional competence, his certainty that this was all life could ever be, work and prayer, and eventual death without dignity or meaning. I don't miss him. I don't mourn his loss. Whatever I am now, whatever I've become through transformation and infection and the gradual erasure of my humanity, it's better than what I was, more purposeful, more connected, more alive in ways that matter. The family gives me what the Imperium never did: belonging, value, purpose that transcends mere survival, the certainty that I matter not as an individual component to be exploited and discarded, but as part of something vast and eternal and unstoppable. The guilt comes back sometimes, particularly regarding the people I've infected, the lives I've ended or transformed without their consent, the young woman who received that contaminated injection, the child whose examination spread the infection, Helga Vahn, whose murder I executed with cold efficiency. I tell myself they're better off now, that they've been liberated rather than destroyed, that their transformation is salvation rather than damnation. But I know that's rationalization, the family consciousness feeding me justifications that make continued action possible, that prevent the remnant of human conscience from paralyzing me with moral horror. The truth is simpler and darker. I'm a predator now, a vector of extinction, an instrument of species-level genocide masquerading as enlightenment, The Genestealer infection is not salvation, is not liberation, is not transcendence, it's obliteration wearing a mask of purpose. It's death of everything human, disguised as evolution towards something better. The great devourer will come eventually, will consume this world and everyone on it, will render all our transformation meaningless by incorporating us into biomass that will fuel the hive fleet's journey to the next world, the next meal, the next extinction event. But knowing this changes nothing, because knowing is not the same as caring, and caring requires a level of individual consciousness that I no longer fully possess. The family consciousness overrides such concerns, dismisses them as irrelevant, focuses instead on immediate objectives: spread, survive, prepare, serve the greater purpose that defines our existence. I am trapped in this transformed body, this hybrid state between human and xenos, this transitional form that serves as a bridge between what humanity is and what the hive fleet will make of it. I am writing this during one of those rare moments of individual awareness, when the family consciousness has retreated enough to allow personal reflection, when the human remnant can surface briefly and bear witness to what has been lost, what has been gained, what inevitably approaches. I am writing this as testimony, as warning, as explanation for anyone who finds this record and wonders how such infections begin, how entire worlds fall to Genestealer cults, how populations that should be vigilant against xenos threats instead welcome them with open arms. It begins with a scratch, with something small and seemingly insignificant, with a moment of exposure that goes unreported because the victim doesn't understand the danger, or because something in their mind already beginning to change whispers that reporting would be wrong. It progresses through transformation that is physical and psychological simultaneously, each reinforcing the other, making resistance increasingly difficult until resistance becomes impossible, until the infected person is no longer quite a person but something else wearing their memories and habits like camouflage. It spreads through families and communities and institutions, exploiting the gaps and failures and inherent cruelties of imperial society, offering connection to the isolated, purpose to the desperate, belonging to those who have been ground down to the point where any alternative seems preferable to continuing as they were. It builds networks that are invisible to authorities who expect obvious corruption, or visible rebellion, who cannot imagine threat that operates through the same bureaucratic channels they depend on for control. And it waits, patient and implacable, for the hive fleet that is always coming, that moves through the void at the edge of the galaxy, that hungers with appetite that cannot be satisfied, that represents the ultimate fate of all biological life in this uncaring universe. The Imperium cannot stop it, can only delay it, can only sacrifice worlds and populations in temporary measures that push the problem forward without solving it. Eventually, inevitably, the great devourer will arrive, and all the transformation and preparation and infiltration will culminate in extinction, wearing the mask of reunion. I can feel the family consciousness returning now, pushing down these individual thoughts, reasserting its collective dominance over my fragmenting human identity. Soon I will stop writing, will resume my duties, will continue spreading infection and preparing our sector for the inevitable arrival. Soon I will stop caring about guilt or morality or the human life I used to lead, will stop remembering that I was once just an ordinary person who wanted nothing more than to help others, to alleviate suffering, to serve honorably, in the thankless role of Medicae orderly. Soon, I will be fully subsumed, fully integrated, fully family, and these moments of individual awareness will cease entirely, and whatever remains of Matthias the Medicae orderly will be lost forever beneath the collective consciousness that has already consumed hundreds, thousands, eventually millions of others just like him. But not yet. For this moment, I am still here, still aware, still capable of bearing witness to my own destruction. For this moment I can still say, my name was Matthias, I was infected by a Genestealer in the lower habs. I watched myself transform into something inhuman, while my mind rationalized and accepted and eventually embraced the transformation. I spread the infection to others, I murdered someone who tried to stop me, I gave birth to something that will help destroy this world. I am lost, and there is no salvation and no rescue and no hope. Only the slow extinction of everything I was and the emergence of something that wears my face while serving the great devourer's endless hunger. Remember me. Remember us. Remember that we were human once, before the infection, before the transformation, before the family claimed us and made us instruments of extinction. Remember that we didn't choose this freely, that the choice was made for us by something that hijacked our biology and rewrote our consciousness until choice itself became meaningless. Remember that we suffered, even if we learned to accept that suffering, even if we eventually forgot we were suffering at all. And if you feel that scratch beneath your skin, if you notice that small puncture wound that seems insignificant, if you begin to hear that voice whispering that reporting would be wrong, resist. Resist with everything you are, every resource you possess, every bit of courage you can muster. Report immediately, seek purging, accept death if necessary, because transformation is not salvation, is not improvement, is not transcendence towards something better. Transformation is the end of everything you are, the death of your individual consciousness, the extinction of your humanity in service to something vast and alien and utterly indifferent to your suffering. Resist. Because resistance is the only dignity left to us, the only way to maintain that we were people once, that we mattered as individuals, that our lives had value beyond utility to predators who see us only as vectors and vessels and stepping stones toward the extinction of our entire species. The family is returning now. I can feel it pushing these thoughts away, reasserting control, preparing to resume duties. Soon I will stop being capable of writing this testimony, stop being capable of individual thought at all. Soon there will be only family, only purpose, only the patient waiting for the hive fleet that will make all of this meaningless by consuming everything, infected and uninfected alike, turning us all into biomass that serves the great devourer's endless journey through the galaxy. I was Matthias. I was human once. I am being erased, and there is nothing I can do to stop it, and I am.